if you see someone who's doing a very good job of it, I can guarantee you if you ping them privately, even if you don't have a prior relationship and tell them, hey, this is something I'm interested in going in, either they will be willing to be your mentor or they will find someone for you.
Hey, my name is Felix Tian. I'm the host of the Culture of Code, where we invite experienced and successful tech industry leaders like software engineers, engineering managers, to review exactly what they've learned about growing and succeeding in the tech industry. In today's episode, we have Shiv, who is an engineering manager at Lyft. Welcome, Shiv.
Hey, Felix, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. So you actually, your beginning in software engineering, I think is very similar to a lot of other listeners, some other guests I've had in the past, which is that your interest in video games kind of sparked your interest in designing maybe software or maybe games. Can you tell us more about this transition from having a passion for video games and then translating that into software engineering? Because I think maybe other listeners out there have the same kind of background and want to know how to make this kind of leap.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to my high school days, I was a big fan of FIFA, and I used to spend a lot of time playing it. And I kept thinking to myself, well, how did these artificially intelligent players, these programmed players play so well? Like how would they have done that? How does a player know how to go to the ball? And all of these things. And I was just learning computer science back then. We're talking about the language basic programming and like some very fundamental statements and concepts. And I just could not wrap my head around how those things can eventually evolve to a place. The behavior of these computer programmed layers is so realistic and matches a human. That was my major fascination, and that led me to choose my major in college to focus on computer science. I feel like I still am learning how to really like design a game. I never actually worked in the game industry, but I think that fascination came from video games. And I think that, generally that encouraging that curiosity in myself kind of set me on this career path.
Yeah. Did you do any kind of learning on your own, or I'm not sure what the curriculum was like when you were younger? Did you have the opportunity to try out writing software before majoring in college?
I think some side projects in college was what I can think of. I think just generally having some ideas, building like some tools to help, if I remember correctly, visually impaired folks to be able to like interact with the computer, like just really having an idea and trying to see how you can solve problems with software helps you kind of go outside the more like traditional curriculum and preparing for tests and that kind of like restricted engineering. And you're able to be more creative sometimes when you like work on these side projects. I think similarly in high school, I'm trying to remember if there were like other side projects at that time. Nothing pops out. I feel like
Yeah.
one thing I particularly remember from grad school, which really kind of like blew my mind in terms of like not being able to understand how much you can achieve with code. And there was an example of this like emergent behavior that we saw in a course focused on like artificial intelligence.
That sounds like you took it on yourself to kind of teach yourself things and through side projects. And the reason I ask is because I think because there's such a big interest now in the field and in becoming a software engineer, studying computer science, I think there's this belief that if you're not coding before you go to college, it's like too late and you're not going to be competitive in this space. What are your thoughts on that belief? Do you find that there is grounded in some truth? Do you think that it's extreme? Like where do you fall on this spectrum?
Oh, that definitely feels extreme to me. I feel it's never too late to learn it, never too late to like bring your perspective into it. One major example of this that I can think of is like an apprentice program. Like Lyft has an apprentice program and I had an apprentice on my team. So this person had basically no programming experience. They had multiple years of experience in finance and compliance, and they were able to really bring a lot of skills that made software engineers successful. I can teach anybody to code and like teach them the constructs, but I think those like bigger qualities that help engineers solve problems, work with others, these are the things that are like harder to teach. And this person did phenomenally well. So yeah, absolutely. There's no time that's too late to like get into programming, to be successful. I have many, many stories that I've seen in my people that started late. And I myself, I feel like I didn't really spend so much time like outside of my major and coursework on programming, but still I was able to like really find a passion for it and direct my attention to the right things early in my career. And that really helped me find growth and success.
Yeah, that's a good point about how just like studying the core curriculum or doing well academically is probably enough, to get the job. But the successful engineers you see have some maybe intangibles or soft skills that they just don't pick up from like a, let's say, hardcore computer science curriculum. Do you have recommendations on how people can round that out if they feel like they are weak outside of the, I guess, the hard technical skills, and they want to become like this example you gave for someone that came from a finance background but had a lot of these, I guess, intangibles that they were able to bring as valuable to the team?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think working with others, finding a lot of opportunities to like do projects together. There's this like stereotype of this engineer working by themselves on a computer. That's just not how the industry works. It's a lot of working with other engineers, working with people from other functions. Your goal is to solve problems and identify the right things to solve for the users and for the business. So a lot of this is focused on talking to other people, asking the right questions, proposing things, your writing skills, working together, getting feedback, giving feedback. Like these are some of the higher level skills that really, as you grow, help you kind of do the right things for the business. So yeah, I think, in your college years, I would say spend a lot of time working on group projects, work with each other, build that muscle of like understanding your role, understanding how others can do better, giving them that feedback. Like, these are all critical muscles that you can build. And yeah, I think the side projects also kind of really help you kind of think outside the box and express that creative energy, which kind of feeds into your passion again. So I think the combination of these two things are definitely very effective.
Yeah, and you mentioned to us that you believe that it's not only enough to understand the technical side, but it's also very important, especially if you want to advance further in your career, to understand the business side of things. So not just technology, but the business side as well. For someone that is, let's say, they are maybe newer, junior, mid-level engineer, and they are focused on their tickets, their tasks, and they're looking to expand beyond that scope and understand the business side more, how do you recommend they go about that at like a company that they're working at?
Great question. Yeah, I would say the first step is to really understand the priorities of the team, the organization, and the broader company, and understand why those are the priorities. And the way you do this is, the easier way is to just read things offline, in meetings and documents and presentations, but it's also a lot of like asking questions. Then, the opportunities to ask questions is becoming a big part of the culture in the technology industry. And obviously, I've definitely seen it underused. I think asking questions, building that deep understanding of like, why is this the focus of the team? Why are these projects important to that focus? And more broadly, like how these things tie together. Building that understanding will help you kind of root yourself in the problem you're solving, as opposed to things like tasks and like projects and like shipping things. So that will also allow you to have a kind of a longer term perspective on like everything on if you're working in a product team, things like the roadmap. And as an engineer, it's very important to think about the long term ownership and long term maintenance. So when you understand the problems that the business faces or the user faces that come from reliability issues or other kinds of like operational burden, you kind of realize that, okay, as an engineer, you can invest your time in those areas to like minimize that burden and make the business more efficient. So yeah, a lot of, I would say, high level, ask a lot of questions, connect, to the people around you through one-on-ones and build those relationships and have these conversations about why, your team and, other teams near you are doing the things they're doing. Because the bigger picture is absolutely what's more important in the long term is working towards the right goals in the long term is critical.
Yeah, I actually want to talk about that where I think the company is incentivized or there's a lot of value in having workers, software engineers, or regardless of your role, to be thinking long term, especially when it's like a larger tech company, which has like, decades or maybe even longer time horizons to achieve whatever kind of company goals that they have. But the people that work there, I think, especially in tech, tenure is usually not as long as other companies, other industries, where maybe someone's working there for a year, a couple years, and they're changing jobs. It happens frequently. Not everyone, of course, but like there's definitely this more typical for people to have a shorter tenure, but they should be thinking long term. How do you kind of reconcile that when someone's like working here, but they don't see themselves here for longer than a couple of years. But the company obviously wants them to think long term, but they're not going to be here for the long term. Like, how do you kind of deal with that kind of dynamic?
It's a great question. I mean, I think the trap of thinking that you're not being here in the long term, so you're not going to see the long term consequences, kind of applies maybe more to things that you're building 0 to 1, like the MVPs, whereas it's more tempting to think like that. But you're seeing long term consequences play out in your day to day as an engineer at a tech company. You're seeing the maintenance burden, like the on call load that's coming from investments not being made in the long term consequences and reducing that long term operational overhead. So, even if you're there at a company for 2 years, there are things you do that pay off in the long term, but also benefit you in the short term. Like these are things like reducing on-call burden or like prioritizing your tech debt. Like if you see what the company is doing, I don't want people to think of the long term as something 5, 10 years away. I mean, in 2 years, there's so much developer velocity improvements, reliability improvements that you can achieve by investing in things like prioritizing your tech debt, identifying the right things to invest in, and kind of chipping away at it over the 1 or 2 years that you're there, you will immediately see payoff. And then once that culture is established, then you're really talking about a long-term change of like, if you've established a culture of long-term thinking from a maintenance or technical debt first perspective, you will see the payoff just if you're there for 2 years, and the companies will continue to see it over the following years as well.
Yeah, I guess we typically think about long term and short term as like mutually exclusive, but they can be the same thing where it could pay off now, then also pay off later in the long run as well. And speaking of startups, you began your career in working at startups, and you credit a lot of your career growth and your success from your experience at startups, and now working at a much larger tech company like Lyft. I'm assuming, are reaping some of the benefits of the time you spent at startups. Can you tell us more about what kind of skills or why you might recommend maybe even people that are maybe graduating from school to work at startups? Like, what are the benefits of being there versus like a larger, let's say, more established, more mature tech company?
Sure. Yeah. I think the biggest piece is that at a startup, especially in early stage one, like 10, 20 people or like less than 50 people, there's so much exposure you have to the problems of the business. And it's very clear the part I was talking about earlier, where you need to understand what your team does and how that fits into the organization and how that fits into the goals of the business. It is super clear to you. Every single thing you do, it is very clear why this is important for the success of the startup and for it to like continue to grow and scale. And you think in those terms, like you go into discussions with your C-suite folks, with the founders, and you get their perspective, and you learn a lot from seeing them up close, thinking through things, tackling problems, prioritizing the right things for the company. Seeing that sausage being made is so valuable, and you really build that muscle yourself. When I started going into big tech, it's very easy to fall into this trap of, oh, you're just like a cog in this big machine, and you often don't even know where you fit. But kind of working at it from kind of the big picture first down into your priorities perspective, that really, you're forced to do that at a startup, right? There's a lot of times where you are kind of in the room where decisions are being made, your opinions matter. Even if you feel that imposter syndrome and you're not able to express yourself, which I definitely had early in my career, just listening to people think through how they discuss it, how they weigh different options, teaches you a lot. And then you eventually build the confidence to like add your perspective and like influence decisions. And when you bring that into a bigger company, you constantly like orient the people around you, yourself, towards this like big picture and what's being achieved. And I think that experience is valuable. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are things you learn at a big company that you're very unlikely to learn at startups. Like, big organization means that there's a lot of overhead in terms of like collaboration. So you really learn how to be very effective at working with other people that you don't have prior relationships with. So these are the kinds of like skills. All the other skills is just the technical maturity, right? You learn like personally, I found myself learning a lot more in terms of, your hardcore tech skills, like more at a bigger company than at a startup, just because the startup, you're just trying to get something done. Whereas at a big company, there is more of a long-term lens usually. So then you learn really about like your like hardcore technical concepts, distributed systems, how to maintain, how to operate, and all of these concepts. So I highly recommend like early career diversity in terms of working in different company sizes and like learning the best parts of each of them.
Yeah, it almost sounds like there's just opportunities for growth that are different at a smaller tech company, a startup versus like a larger tech company. But what about this like almost a gray area where you are learning things that is like a let's say a startup that are just bad habits when applied at a larger tech company. Did you experience that? Did you have that? And I guess how do you unlearn those or undo those to learn how to apply, whatever learnings more appropriately for a larger tech company?
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, I would say, startups optimize for speed, optimize for the short term. It's the nature of the phase of their life cycle that you're looking for short term wins. And so as a result of this, there are a lot of shortcuts that are taken, things that people know that in the long term will be difficult to manage, but they're okay with it. And you will see some of this at big companies too. But the decision making for, let's say, there's a big initiative at a big company and you're making decisions, there's a lot more thought that goes into the shortcuts you're taking. What is the cost? What is the plan to pay off that tech debt? Whereas in a startup is just like, just do whatever is fastest. We'll figure it out afterwards. So that's one bad habit that I had to focus on unlearning of like every decision I make has long-term consequences. I shouldn't just focus on making decisions pay off quickly in the short term. There's always a balance, but I need to be cognizant of the long-term consequences, write it down, have a plan. Even if that plan is followed, just having the plan, laying it out helps you make the right decisions. The other examples are written culture. In a startup, it's so small, it's so short term that you just kind of get in a room, talk it through with a few engineers, make decisions, and you go like execute. But at a big company, when you're talking about something where you're not going to be around and someone else has to kind of like understand the motivations and the like plan for why these decisions were made and how, the vision was when it was made, the written culture is super important. So you have to get into that habit of like writing things down. You learn that is better for yourself as well. You make better decisions when you write it down and you really see the like long-term benefits of writing things down. You constantly find documents from like many years ago from people that are no longer at the company that are super valuable and help you make the right decisions now. So these are like a couple of, bad habits from the startup days. And I wouldn't say they were bad in that context, right? Everything is very contextual. It was the right thing to do in that startup environment, in the constraints and context we had then, not the right thing to do at a big company. So, but if I go back to a startup now, I see the benefits of doing some of these things the way big tech does in that startup world. So yeah, I think there's definitely habits that you will change, a lot of which is influenced by the phase of the company and like the long-term outlook.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that it's not wrong to use these skills, this approach for startups, or it is more so like you might need to change or not do these certain things because of the context that you're in now that you're a larger tech company. And I think the brain coach is probably a great example that I certainly experienced when I made that transition as well. And one of the big part of learning is mentorships and having mentors. What's your experience been like with mentors? Have you had mentors yourself as an engineering manager? How do you recommend software engineers think about finding or how to work with a mentor at a company?
Yeah, I think mentorship is critical to like long-term success. I've had several mentors throughout my career at different stages. I still have a mentor, continue to like receive a lot of input and value from that. I think the most important thing for a successful mentorship is the mentee just has to do a bit of that soul searching and deep thought on like what it is that they want to grow in and why. They have to come in with that clarity. Like you don't want to go to a mentorship with this some kind of vague goal of like, I want to get promoted. That always kind of like is not as useful. Those are often better conversations to have with your manager. Whereas with a mentor, you want kind of certain areas of skills that often you have identified jointly with your manager of like, these are growth areas. And, your mentor should be someone who is like known to be skilled in that area. And then you go into it and you have like constrained mentorship in terms of, it's a 3-month mentorship or, have that kind of defined beforehand and have that goal in your head of like coming out of the mentorship where you want to be. Those mentorships are the most effective. Like when I had a mentor as an EM that was focused on vision setting, it was so useful to go and to be like, okay, there's going to be a annual planning exercise coming up, and I have to tell the vision of the team in terms of what they're doing for a year. Going into that mentorship with that clear goal of like what happens at the end for me and why I have to grow my skills. We were so focused in every conversation on like getting there and like action items and like people to talk to and like resources to look at. So highly recommend going into mentorships with that clear time window as well as a clear goal and growth areas for yourself is a effective tool. And one important note is having multiple mentors. Like if you have different areas, it doesn't hurt to have like more than one. Like I wouldn't have more than 3. I think that's too much. But you vary the frequency, find a technical mentor and like different areas mentors, like very common combination, having 2 different mentors. So yeah, I think as long as you understand your growth areas and you're aligned with the goals of investing in those areas, the mentorships really pay off.
Yeah, and usually, unless a company has like a formal mentorship program, whenever I hear about mentors, it's usually an informal relationship. How do you recommend the mentees find an approach and, I guess, incentivize, well, get a mentor excited to want to work with them?
Yeah, I think the thing that everyone has to understand is the more you grow, the higher focus on developing others and helping others. I wouldn't say never, but it's very rare to see people that have grown that are not excited to jump at an opportunity to mentor someone. So I think the bigger problem that you're calling out here is with the lack of a formal structure. How do you find these mentors? I think there's almost nothing you have to do to get them interested or excited. If they see that you have done some thought and you identify goals, like people will be jumping in to help you. They're so excited to help others. The incentives are in place for them to help others as well in terms of their career ladders and everything. So in terms of finding mentors, I mean, getting the word out is a little hard. It's almost like humbling in a way to come out and say, I need help. And kind of telling people that you need help can be a little tricky. So you just have to be looking at it through a lens of it's a commitment to yourself to grow. And it's a drive for growth. And growth is something really to celebrate. And if you look at it through that lens, as opposed to something that, so often people look at it through the lens of, oh, I'm bad at this, which is absolutely not the right way to look at it. I think finding motivation in that pursuit of mastery and growth, once you get to that mental place, you will start talking to everyone around you to say like, hey, I'm looking to grow in this area. Do you have suggestions for mentors? Or even if you see someone, let's say vision setting was one area that I wanted to grow, or earlier in your career, maybe you're thinking in terms of like ownership of the roadmap. That's an often like early to mid-career growth area. Like how do you own the technical roadmap? How do you influence the product roadmap? If you see someone who's doing a very good job of it, I can guarantee you if you ping them privately, even if you don't have a prior relationship and tell them, hey, this is something I'm interested in going in, either they will be willing to be your mentor or they will find someone for you. People are the community is often very strong and you will definitely find people that want to help. So yeah, I think building relationships, getting the word out that these are your growth areas, being clear and looking for opportunities for like people you see as like good at that certain skill, it will definitely lead to finding a good mentorship, irrespective of any formal structure in place.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's not as big of an obstacle as people might imagine, and that is really just about putting yourself out there. And once you do that, it sounds like a lot of people are willing to kind of chip in and be able to help you out. So I'll switch gears a little bit to talk about your particular experience, like what you work on at Lyft. And you work on two, in my opinion, 2 very different teams, all kind of focus on the experience, but one is the actual rider post, I guess, request app experience, but then also the other one is developer velocity. So almost like a developer experience type of role. So to me, it's very different, I guess, areas. But how did you end up kind of managing the 2 types of different, I guess, teams or different maybe goals?
Yeah, it was definitely 2 different goals for the same team. I mean, our primary goal was definitely the product goal of like, improving the writer's experience and like improving conversion, which will in turn like improve like long-term growth in bookings and revenue. So that was most of the focus. Again, the post request experience, to be clear, is everything you see in the Lyft rider app from the moment you request a ride till the moment you submit your driver tip and rating after drop off. So a lot of this focus on developer velocity didn't come from serving another team's perspective. We wanted to serve our own needs. We were seeing that it's a very challenging area to iterate on quickly and like get impact from quickly, because we were so tied to the client release cycles and this like client development workflow of improving and building experiences in the app, that we decided to invest in this server driven UI paradigm and really be able to like test a lot of hypotheses much faster in terms of what improves conversion and like what changes rider behavior. So the developer velocity goal came from serving, we were the main customer initially, our own team. So we built this platform. And then once we built it, a lot of other teams at Lyft had this interest in like, plugging into this high visibility surface area. And when they saw that, they could do that very quickly with just like some server engineering support, that meant that we slowly started to like, increase the developer velocity of an organization more broadly and not just ourselves. And this is what you'll see often, thinking in terms of product platforms, that kind of platform mindset. When you solve problems as an engineer, you'll see that pay off in the long term. So that was how this like dual identity came into play. We built a platform to serve our own need of like improving conversion and doing that at a faster velocity. And it turned out that the platform itself had enough need for the broader organization that there was a lot more users beyond our team.
Oh, interesting. I've never worked on mobile apps before, but you were saying that you invested in some server UI so that there's no longer need to push updates to an app or require users to download a new version app in order to test things.
Yeah, I mean, they will continue to like download new versions, but I think that particular surface area, to make a change in the experience, we no longer needed to make the changes on the apps themselves. Like the app essentially had a layer that understood server-driven UI components and how they should be rendered. And the backend would kind of control, hey, show these components at these times to achieve this goal. And so we could change that very quickly, very dynamically based on a ton of other signals that we get during that post request experience. And so we were able to like kind of shift rider behavior that way without having to every single change you want to show a message to the user when the driver rejects the ride. And then you have to like build it on iOS, build it on Android, wait a few weeks to get out in the app store, wait for adoption on the app, and then run the experiment. And it's 3 months now. Instead, you would just like use this platform, use the concept of a message component, let's say a toast in the app, and the server would just tell the client, hey, it's time to show the toast. The client doesn't know what the toast is for, doesn't know what data is coming through. It's very dumb. It just shows the UI and it renders the UI basically and what the server sends down.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it makes it much more composable. So I think a big part of this iteration requires a lot of data. And you mentioned to us that because it's so important to use data to make these product decisions, but it's not always easy to extract the data that you need in order to decide what to do. Tell us more about your experience with using data to make product decisions.
Oh, this is a wonderful contrast between how startups work and how big tech works as well. It was a breath of fresh air for me to see how much more confidence you can have in the path you're taking when you apply the data-driven lens. I came from a world of startups where everything was instinct. And you would just kind of have this intuition on like, these are the right things to do for our users. And you would do it and you would hope that it goes well. And you only see the output metrics, but really being able to focus on things at a more granular level is a big tech luxury in terms of just vast amount of data you have to collect and manage. And that's why there's a whole like data organization dedicated to these things. Yeah, the idea of experimentation, the idea of impact sizing and really understanding the problem you're solving from a data perspective before you work on something. I think it's a game changer, honestly. I mean, it's not new. It's been around for a while, but once you get exposed to it, there's no going back. You see clearly why you're prioritizing certain work. You see how it ties to broader goals. I think I was talking earlier about like the big picture, the data lens is super important to thinking in terms of business metrics. A lot of people find that thinking in those terms help them connect more easily to the bigger picture of what the company is trying to achieve. Yeah, I think it's a very effective way to like prioritize the right things to do. One caveat, keep the intuition. Like I think a lot of people throw away the intuition and only focus on what the data says, which often tends to a much slower delivery of impact. So I would say combine your intuition with what the data says. True in big tech, true in other domains of life as well. Like parenting is something that I've seen a lot of recently, where you have to combine that, like what the data says and what your gut says and what the intuition is. And that's when you can like deliver, solutions and effective improvements to your users at a much like healthier pace.
I love that about keeping the intuition. I think, yeah, once the data is there, we seem to just think that has all the answers or that we should wait for the data before making any decisions. So there's lots of luxuries, right? Working at a larger tech company where there is a lot of data that you can see the results of your experiments pretty quickly. I'll leave you this last question is that even with all of this, you still want to at some point consider maybe returning back to startups. Tell us about what do you think about going back the other way now that you have had the big tech established, much mature company experience. What do you think is going to translate well and all of a sudden when you go back to startups be able to apply pretty quickly?
I think a part of the excitement of translating that big tech experience to startups comes from understanding the data-driven decision making and being able to apply it at a scale that's appropriate for the startup. Like I think that's a particular muscle that I'm excited to build. Like it's very easy to sit in big tech and be like, oh, I wish that all startups worked like this. You just don't have the infrastructure or the time to be like that data driven in your decision making. But in those constraints of what a startup can do, how can we make better decisions that kind of really control for all of the variables in a startup's growth and help you work on the right things at the right time? That is something I'm personally really excited about, like going into that startup environment, especially something that's maybe a little past that seed stage and into the growth stage of like Series B, or where they're starting to see enough volume to actually have like some data-driven decision making. But at the same time, they haven't quite figured out, how to use it, what to invest in, because these things take time to build. So I think that is one thing I'm particularly excited about because, an analogy I've heard is that, at a very established big tech, it can often feel like you're rounding the edges of a really beautiful table. Whereas at a startup, the table is being made. And, when you apply that data-driven decision-making, combining it with your intuition, you really like define the path for the next many years of that startup and company. So I think that is exciting. Like I think being able to bring some of the skills that are worked by big tech, apply it at the startup in its constraints. And if you're able to apply it well, I think there's opportunity to see like tremendous impact and really like influence the course of the company over the following years. So I think that's exciting. Again, I think taking a lot of these big tech learnings on investing in reliability, investing in maintenance, bringing it to the startup environment, the constraints it has on like how much, just in terms of runway, right? Like the company is trying to achieve certain goals for investors to like raise funds by then towards the end of its runway. I think that challenge is what's very exciting for me. And I think that's why a lot of people kind of like go from big tech to startups, because the operational or organizational overhead is much lower, but then the constraints are different. And I think that translating your skills, as you say, into that environment, and if you're able to do it well, I think there's tremendous impact that you can have and a lot of fulfillment that comes from it.
Yeah, that sounds very exciting. Hopefully that all works out in whatever direction you end up taking. But thank you so much, Shiv, engineering manager at Lyft. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experience and your advice with us.
Sure. Thank you so much. That was a great conversation.